welcome you. My name is Sherry Forsyth. I'm a bereavement coach and a peak performance coach. And we are speaking today with Candyce Ossefort-Russell, who comes from Austin, Texas. And we welcome Candyce with us today. Candyce is a experienced psychotherapist dealing in bereavement, grief, and trauma. She works from the experience of being personally affected by grief, as well as having done lots of training in the topics of grief and trauma. Very sadly, Candyce lost her husband when she was 30, very suddenly. And so she brings the huge empathy and wealth of suffering into her work, which makes Candyce's work very real and very, very warm. Candyce also is involved in speaking and writing and training. She teaches other psychotherapists about grief and trauma. And so we have a wealth of experience, Candyce, that you are bringing to our discussion today. And so we are very honored and we warmly welcome you to this interview today. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here.
So as we were saying earlier, it's amazing with technology that I can be sitting in South Africa and Candyce sitting in Texas, and it feels like we're actually in the same room.
Yes, it's really amazing.
So I think, Candyce, I'd like to start by just asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your practice and your specialities and that kind of thing.
Yes, so like you said, I'm a psychotherapist here in Austin, Texas. I have a private practice where I see mostly individual clients. Sometimes I see teens, but mostly individual adults. And I do a lot of work with all kinds of life transition, but bereavement, loss is a very unique kind of life transition that I specialize in. I also do a lot of work with other kinds of trauma, like childhood trauma. I have a lot of clients who are very high functioning people, but who had a lot of trauma in childhood and start to realize that that those things are affecting them. And I find that there's also an intersection. Every time I'm working with somebody who is grieving, the way we deal with intense emotions often has ties to the way we were treated around intense emotions when we were children. So that work goes hand in hand. Is it okay if I tell you a little about my personal story that led to this work? Because it's all tied together. My undergraduate degree is in computer science, and I moved to Austin, Texas to work for IBM as a programmer. And at IBM, I met my husband, my first husband, Marty. And while I was married to him, I realized I really was very good at programming, but I hated it. And I didn't know what I wanted to do instead. And I actually went to therapy for the first time in my 20s to try to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And I was in this career transition zone when we had our son. And when I was 29, I had my son. And it was while I was staying home with my son, I had left IBM. I was going to stay home with my son for a while. And my husband, Marty, got suddenly ill. He was only sick for 6 weeks. He had a virus that attacked his heart, and he died suddenly and unexpectedly. And so there I was with an 11-month-old child. And thank goodness I had that therapist that I had been talking to about my career transition. And she happened to be someone who understood loss in depth. And the thing that I didn't know at the time was that she was unique in that she was not a grief counselor. She was not trying to walk me through some sort of stages of grief model and try to get me through that process quickly. She just stayed with me for years through the darkness of my entire world falling apart. My my religious views shattered, my understanding of just how the world works shattered. I was so, I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, and I was trying to be a good mother and not get mired in grief such that I couldn't be a good mom. So that woman walking through the darkness with me all the way down and through allowed me to actually fully fall apart in a way that allowed me to rebuild my life from the ground up. And it led to a profound sense of strength and growth that I wouldn't wish on anyone, but given what happened to me, because she was with me the whole time and wasn't afraid of all those dark times, I was able to transform. And so it was about 5 years after my husband's death, having gone through that I realized I was called to be a therapist, to help other people in those places. So I have in addition to doing the therapy with people who are going through loss or grief or trauma, I do a lot of training of other therapists, because there are a lot of therapist trainings that are really pretty inaccurate about working with grief, going from the stage model and trying to rush people through. And so I have a passion for helping therapists learn to sit with people in those dark places and not leave them alone. So
I think what you said there, Candice, is so true. The way that the Western society looks at grief is it's like an illness. It's something
yes,
you've got to get over. You've got to go through it quickly, and heaven forbid that 6 months later you might still be battling a little bit.
that's right.
There's immense pressure that's put on people who are grieving by
Yes,
society, who has got it so wrong.
that's right.
Yeah, I can see you agree with that.
Absolutely, I agree.
Yeah.
Yes.
What we're trying to do in these videos, and Candice through her work and me through mine, is to help people realize that when you've lost somebody, especially somebody that you really loved, how can you just shake it off after a week or two, move through it quickly, and be the same person you were before?
Right, right.
You can't be. So if you can find somebody like your therapist was an absolute blessing for you, that will just stay with you.
Yes.
Not telling you what to do, how to do, when to do, but just
Right.
to be with you in that
Yes.
process.
Yes.
It's such a gift. And
It really
we can give that gift to our patients and clients.
That's right.
Like to be offering.
That's right. That's right.
So,
And
Harry,
go ahead. No, that's all right. What you're describing it about how our society looks at grief like an illness that you're supposed to recover from quickly. There's a different metaphor that I like to use, because that seems more accurate, because if you think about it, when you lose someone you deeply love, if you didn't feel the loss, if you didn't feel something, there would be something wrong, right? And I'm not talking about people, please don't mistake that for people who have a hard time feeling their grief. I'm not talking about that. I'm saying when you lose someone you love, it's actually healthy and normal to feel grief. And so I look at it more like an injury, I think about it like having a open heart surgery. It's like your whole being is cut open, and grief is the actual stuff that's like the healing factors. Like if you have a physical cut, your body actually starts putting healing and growth factors into the cut without your choice. And grief, the emotions of grief are that emotionally. They wash into the wound of grief, of loss, and start to heal that wound. And that's how it's supposed to work. Grief is actually a healthy process.
it is. It's, yeah. I'd like to read a quote, well, something that from one of your articles that you were saying, you know, more important than your credentials, your academic credentials, you know the following to be true. What we humans really need is the presence of other humans when we are grieving.
Yes.
Can you add a little bit more about that?
Yes. It's like, it's the presence of other people who are willing to be next to you and witness the pain you're in, so that it's not, so it's like, that's not going to take the pain away. And that's actually not the job of a friend or a therapist or a coach, to take your pain away, but it helps you bear the pain, to know that other people understand. And also, it's not even about having to talk about it necessarily, like with your friends or whatever, for other people who are trying to know what to say or what to do. It's about being willing to talk about it, or being willing to let the person not talk about it if they don't want to, but just to know that these people around you are not afraid of you, and they're not trying to change you or fix you, because you're not broken.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
I was very lucky, Candice, after the loss of our daughter when she was 9. My sister-in-law, she was one of those people. She was just there. She phoned me, I think, every day for a whole year, just checking that I was still okay. She was unconditional in her presence. And I think that's kind of what you're saying, is you arrive there just to say, I am here.
That's right.
I'm not to solve you, to fix you, any of that. I'm just with you, alongside you, while you negotiate this very difficult journey.
That's right. Okay. That's right. Yes.
So leading on from that, if you have a friend who's really battling with grief of someone that they really loved, what are the main things you think are important for the supporter, the person who is just supporting the grieving person?
I think it's mostly to care, you know, to really care and not make assumptions. To be willing to be close in to the pain if the person wants you there. But I think one of the biggest things that I like to, that I think helps, I call it making the implicit explicit, meaning naming what's going on. It's better as a person who's a friend or a family member or caregiver to say, I don't really know what to say right now. I know you're in so much pain and I don't know what you need. What would you like from me right now? That's so much better than not saying anything because you don't know what to say. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think that, you know, many people really battle with that about, you know, they're so frightened they're going to say the wrong thing. So they stay away.
Yes.
All that the grieving person needs is just to be surrounded by the people that love them.
That's right. That's right. And what was the last thing you said?
Without trying to know the answers, you know,
that's right.
What you said there about saying, I don't really know what to do, but I'm here. You know, what do you need from me?
That's right. And if the person says, I don't know, then I think there's a lot of information out there now that talks about how it's not enough to say, I'm here if you need me, let me know if you need anything, because a grieving person often doesn't know what they need, or they're so overwhelmed they won't reach out. And so I agree with that to a point, but some of the advice that's out there right now is to just do stuff, like just go mow somebody's lawn or bring them food or whatever. And sometimes that's right, but sometimes somebody's in a state where they don't want to be opening the door and welcoming somebody with food, you know? So again, if you name that, like, I'm available to help, would you like me to bring you some food? Or would you like me to mow your lawn? I would be willing to do that, you know?
Yeah.
Or yes, or to even say, I'm here if you'd like to talk about your loss, but if you don't want to talk about it, I'm okay with that too. That's so much better than making an assumption on either side, because different people grieve differently, and even a grieving person is going to have different needs hour to hour, day to day.
Absolutely. It's like I often will say to the coaches that I train, when in doubt, ask the question.
That's right.
Thing,
Yes.
ask, would you like me to do this or this? Not a
Yes.
generic question that could have many answers that are going to be totally overwhelming for the person who's grieving. So
that's right.
Question with very specific kind of guidelines.
Yes. Yes.
Anything else, Candice, that you can think of regarding helping someone, being a friend to someone who's grieving?
I think it's, again, as you kind of help them realize that grief can go on for a very long time. And so not having expectations of what the person ought to be feeling at any given time. What was I going to say about that? Oh, also being willing to help the person distract from their grief if that's what they're doing, if they need that in the moment, or being willing to change plans if the person had decided they wanted to go out for dinner and then at the last minute says, I can't do it. I can't go out. Be understanding, put up with that kind of shifting sands of somebody's emotions.
So I think really what you're saying is to allow the person who's grieving to be in the center of what you are doing.
That's right. That's right.
Them rather than, ourselves, but really try to do what they need.
That's right.
Very caring, empathetic way. Yeah, I think that's pretty good.
Yes, and there was an article that I quoted in my blog post about how to help a grieving friend. I don't remember the name of the author. I like to credit people when they create things, but it was an article in the LA Times, I believe, a few years ago, where this woman who was describing going through a grief process created this diagram that I found very helpful. It's like a series of concentric circles with the griever in the middle, and then the people who are closest to the griever, like the family members and best friends, in the first circle out, and then farther out, the people at your children's school, and after that. So the rule that this woman made with this diagram was care in, dump out. Meaning anyone from the griever on in, if you're on a circle that's outside that, you only offer care and concern to the people, the griever and the people closest into them. Other people are also going to have feelings about the loss. And so, like, my husband died young and suddenly, so a lot of people were grieving and overwhelmed and stunned at his loss, and they needed to talk about it too. But you can talk about that with people who are in your same ring or out farther, right?
Yeah,
but don't talk about your own grief don't dump your own grief on the people who are closer in. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. So you care at the concentric circles that are littler than you are.
Yes.
And you can dump out that way.
Yes.
That's excellent.
Yes, because we need to acknowledge that the people who are helping grievers are also having feelings about this and might be concerned about their friend or family member who's grieving. It's hard to watch someone you love fall apart. So I want to acknowledge that the caregivers also need care. They just need to get it from someone outside the circle.
I think it takes immense courage to care for someone who's grieving, to have the courage to yeah, as you say, watch them literally fall apart, watch them really battling with their pain. And
That's right.
what we're encouraging is for people out there to have the courage to be,
That's right.
to be there for their family members or friends who are grieving.
That's right. And to get the support they need to hold on to that courage. Mm-hmm.
Candice, in your work with grieving patients, what are the most common problems or issues that you are needing to deal with?
Let's see. So I want, there's a couple of layers. I think one is initially a lot of people feel a lot of shame about not grieving right because our culture is so silent and pathologizing of grief. So I have a lot of clients who are grieving who come in and think they're either not feeling enough or they're feeling too much or it's taking too long. And so a lot of what I do up front is really reassure people about the normality of what they're going through. Because there's layers of pain. If you're grieving, that's hard enough. If you're afraid that you're grieving wrong, that's an extra layer of pain that creates anxiety and fear and shame. So I try to scoop that anxiety, fear, shame piece off the top and help people just deal with the pain of the grief. But then once you're down into that, and people are just with their grief, one of the things that is difficult about grief for a lot of people is that we as humans develop ways of coping with big emotions throughout our lives, and that depends on our temperament, like how we're wired when we're born. It depends on how our families handle big emotions when we're little kids. It depends on whether you're safe enough in your current environment to express your emotions, all of that. So we have coping mechanisms that we've all unconsciously put in place throughout our lives for dealing with big emotions. Grief, when you have a major loss, the emotions that go with grief can be more intense than anything many people have ever experienced in their lives as adults that they remember. And those big emotions often push up through those coping mechanisms that we're used to using to keep our emotions in a right size that we can manage. And so I think one thing that scares people and makes them feel overwhelmed is that these emotions they're big and your natural coping mechanisms often don't work. That you're just like stuck in sadness day after, or enormous sadness, or rage can come up, or long periods of feeling a lot of feelings, and you can't. And so once I help normalize that for people and help them realize it's because these feelings are bigger than anything you've ever known, your normal coping mechanisms, your regularly used coping mechanisms aren't working. I'm going to help you discover some new ones,
Yeah, and I think what you've said there is many people are terrified of the power of those emotions.
That's right.
They don't know what to do with it, so they rather block them or deny them.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
So you actually choose.
Yes.
Those.
That's right. That's right. And then another thing that I really help people understand a lot that I don't hear talked about is that when you have a major loss, or any kind of loss, but especially a big loss, not only are you grieving the person that you lost, how you miss that person, and the fact that they're not there. It's like you said early on in our conversation, people want you to go back to being the person you were before. You will never be the person you were before. Because part of what's happening in a major loss and part of what you're grieving is what they call self-organization. The way we feel as a self, who we are, how we fit in our community, how we fit in our lives as a mother or a wife or a daughter, all of that is actually wired into our brains. And when we have a major loss, that way our whole self is organized comes apart. And part of the pain of grief is feeling that disconnect of all the parts of ourselves. And part of grieving and rebuilding is coming together with a new level of self-organization without that person in it, but with memories and ways of staying connected to that person in it. And that process of a self coming apart and then rebuilding is how our psyches are wired to work. It's how growth happens, even when it's not about something traumatic. But when it's traumatic, that is a very specific piece of pain that goes along with the loss of the person. And when I help people understand that they're grieving different things, all related to the loss of this person, it helps them then be more specific in understanding what their feelings are about and give themselves some compassion for how hard it is to rebuild yourself when it's come apart.
That makes such sense. That's brilliant.
Yeah.
And I think that if people understood that, immediately it would be a big load would be lifted off them.
That's right. That's right.
So
Yes.
Candice, how would people, I'm thinking about our viewers out there, how would they know if they are needing to come and see a psychotherapist or a coach? Okay. Or do everybody would benefit?
So that's I love that question, because there's different people say different things about this. Some people say everyone should go to therapy or support for grief. Some people say you only need to get help if something's going wrong with your grief. I think it depends. I think that if you are having trouble, sometimes people's grief can turn into depression. Grief and depression are not the same thing, but sometimes if somebody's having a hard time rebuilding their life and they may have struggled with depression in the past, or their grief might morph into depression, or their grief might be so overwhelming that they're having a hard time functioning at all. And in those kinds of cases where you're really having a hard time with daily living to a point where it's very hard for you to function. I hesitate to say that because a lot of grief makes it hard to function. But I'm talking about, massive loss of function that persists. Then yes, go get some help because the grief is just overwhelming you and you need some support. But I also think because of this part of grief where we're alone in a society that doesn't really like to support people who are grieving, and because of the self-rebuilding piece, regular grief that's proceeding normally could still warrant having some support. Like me, when I was going through my loss, my grief, it was years that I was grieving, and so much came apart that I was trying to rebuild. My grief was normal. I wasn't having a bad grief experience. It was a normal process I was going through, but having a therapist go through it with me helped me not feel alone and helped me stick with it instead of just shoving it aside. So, but some people really want to do it on their own, and their grief, it's a natural process and they can feel it moving. And even if they feel a lot, they're okay without going to support. But I really do encourage anyone who feels like they're struggling more than they feel comfortable with, or if they just really don't want to feel alone with it.
Yeah, because grief is a very isolating process.
Yes.
And so just if you need support, but also if you really are battling. So
that's right.
Candice, what is your take on dysfunctional or complicated grief? Do you buy into that concept?
So here's what I think about that. I don't like those terms. I don't mind complicated grief. I don't like disordered grief or any of those pathological terms. What I find is what I mentioned earlier is that the way we manage big emotions has an awful lot to do with how big emotions were handled in our families. So I think a massive loss and a lot of grief is a massive unchosen opportunity to heal wounds from the past around painful emotions. Yes. What I find is that when people are struggling with grief, it's because, let's just say, you were shamed for feeling sad when you were a child. And now in adulthood, you have a loss and you are starting to feel depressed and overwhelmed because your grief is being pushed down unconsciously because it feels so shameful to cry. It feels so shameful to be vulnerable because the way those emotions were handled when you were a child is in your unconscious. It's wired into the lower part of your brain where you manage emotions. It's mostly not conscious for people. So if somebody's struggling with their grief and, for example, getting depressed or even having mood problems of being angry and irritable because there's this feeling that they can't acknowledge coming up, that's an opportunity for me to help somebody recognize that they have a lot of shame about their sadness that comes from the past. And so we get, it's 2 for 1 kind of, right? Where I actually have an opportunity to help somebody heal old wounds in order to clear it's like clearing the channel so that the grief can start to flow in a natural way. So that's what I think. Any complicated grief or, grief that's not moving along is caused by stuff like that. Also, complicated relationships with the person you've lost can definitely cause, multiple layers and types of feelings that can be confusing to people. So
it's almost what you're saying is when you feel stuck, when it's not moving, when there's no flow.
Yes,
that is when you maybe need more professional help than other times.
that's right. That's right.
That's so good.
Yeah.
Candice, you also mentioned earlier that sadness is not depression. Can you
Yes.
talk a little bit about that for us?
Yes. What you just said is really tied to that. It's any emotion that is what I call a core emotion, an emotion that's not blocked or shunted because of some fear of it or some old thing. Any emotion that is not blocked and just expressed leads to adaptive actions. That's the evolutionary purpose of having emotions. So sadness, even the sadness of grief that might go on for a really long time, it actually moves through us in waves. It's like there's a movement of like a rush of sadness that comes up and expresses and moves through. So sadness or anger or loneliness or any of these emotions that go with grief, when they're flowing and moving, even if they're painful, they're not stuck and it's not causing depression. Depression is actually a draining of life force that comes when we can't express our emotions. So if you can't express your sadness, or if you can't express, it could be anger, it could be happiness. Sometimes people feel guilty for feeling happy at all during the time they're grieving or regaining a sense of happiness and serenity in their lives. People can feel guilty for that, so they push their happiness down. Any emotion that's like being ignored and pushed down, it doesn't go away. It just drains your life energy out. So that kind of down, not moving state of depression is caused by that lack of life energy that comes from a lack of expressing emotion. So, yeah. And so that's, depression feels like stuck. It's unmoving. It doesn't change day to day, hour to hour.
Like a log jam. Nothing's.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Candice, if you mentioned that people can get quite angry when they are grieving, it's one of the emotions they feel.
Mm-hmm.
What would you recommend for somebody who, let's say in the loss of a child, and the one spouse or maybe the sibling is excessively angry, it's actually damaging the relationships within the rest of the family. What would you recommend for that person who is so angry?
Well, I think it helps if you have someone to go talk to about that. Somebody who can help you express that anger in a place and a way where it's not going to hurt people, right? It's like I think that and I think it depends on like who the person is angry at, because anger, it's not always this, but an awful lot of anger within grief is based on attachment theory. It's based on a protest, right? That kind of anger is about, it's not fair, it's not right. I had a lot of anger that had no place to be, that no aim when my husband died, because I was just enraged with the way life works, that a young, healthy man could die in 6 weeks. It's like, it's an existential rupture, where I was just enraged. Like, basically it comes down to, it's not fair, and I had to have a place to just rail at that, and to be able to go to my therapist's office and just yell and cry and, and all of that was very important, or to journal it. I think it helps when somebody's really angry to name that, because I think sometimes that we feel that anger and we don't know, it just is anger and you don't know what it's at or what it's about. And so then it can leak out at other people. I know when I was really angry from my grief, I had more road rage and, just impatience with people who were a little slow at the grocery store or whatever. And once I realized, like, it didn't make it go away, but when I realized what it was about, and I gave my on a regular basis to just let myself experience it, it helped a lot.
Because then there's not the buildup.
Right. And I think, that's something that our society is also terrible at, is understanding nuances of emotion, and that there's different types of any emotion. Because I think it's true that when people have a lot of anger, that's not about protest. That's more like anger at, I don't know, I'm trying to think of like that hostile negative anger that comes out, that hurts people. That kind of anger, to kind of like go beat a pillow or something, they found that kind of catharsis doesn't help. It actually makes it worse. It perpetuates and keeps that angry energy going. And so I don't recommend what I'm about to recommend for grief anger, for that kind of anger. But when you have anger that's coming from protest because of a loss, where there is just that, it's like really visceral, just like that protest against what's happened, and coming up against things that you cannot change, that you want to change. I think having some physical release of that anger is very helpful. Like running helped me a lot, and I'd run and like just pound my feet on the pavement, or I used a baseball bat and smacked a chair with it. And, so physical release of that kind of protest can actually be really useful. So
I agree. Any kind of exercise, it kind of diffuses. It's almost
yes.
all your anger into the exercise you're doing, and you come back quite exhausted, but in a way cleansed as a result.
That's right. Yes.
And are there any other sort of negative emotions, strong negative emotions, that are very common with lots of people who are grieving?
Let's see. Anguish. I mean, sometimes it's a very specific kind of pain, like anguish, just feeling kind of wretched and tortured, which is probably a flavor of sadness, but it's a very particular flavor of sadness.
Stronger than sadness, almost.
Yes. And even despair sometimes, because I think part of what happens in that self-disorganization, if the loss is big enough, like I would imagine losing a child, and losing a young person out of order, you know, when it's a child or like a young spouse, it really wreaks havoc with this deep layer of existential beliefs that we all unconsciously carry about the world, where we believe we're going to be okay when we believe we're going to make it through the day. We believe that, if you get sick, you're going to get better, those kinds of things. And so when you come to terms with those existential truths that really are there for all of us to have to deal with at some point, running into things that you cannot change, that you cannot control, that aren't fair, that are just the way life is because we are mortal, there can be a level of despair that's not the negative kind of despair. That's not the kind of despair that leads to suicidality or anything. That kind of despair is part of depression. And of course, we want to get help with helping that kind of abate. But there can be a kind of existential despair that comes when people are really contending with those deep existential truths. And again, that's an emotion that needs to just have somebody be there and witness it and help you hold.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, awareness and somebody witnessing are so relevant. And
that's right.
People don't really know how to witness. They always, in our society, we feel we've got to do something always.
That's right.
Feel better. And sometimes we don't. Sometimes
that's
we just have to be there and validate their emotion, validate where they are.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, and another, loneliness is another one that can come up a lot, especially for people who, I guess it shows up in different forms for different types of loss. I don't know. I know I've worked with people who've lost children, and there's a certain kind of loneliness that can come when you're in a society where everybody is going through the raising of their children, not having to feel that loss, not having to feel that pain that goes on when you've lost a child. I'm sure you know that loss that continues, because you always know that the developmental level that your child would be at, you're not experiencing that child. And so there can be a lot of loneliness being around people who don't know that pain and haven't had to face that pain. I know I experienced a lot of loneliness as a young widow, and people who've lost spouses contend with loneliness a lot. And that's another emotion our culture does terrible with. And because that's another one that our culture calls an illness, that if people are lonely, they're having health problems and stuff. And yes, there's negative loneliness where people don't have enough social connection. But something that's very interesting that I've found that they've even done studies about is that there is a difference between loneliness that's a lack of having social contact and loneliness that is about missing a partner. They're not the same. Going out with friends does not assuage the loneliness of longing for a partner. And having a partner doesn't necessarily assuage the loneliness of not having enough social connections. So that's a really important one. If somebody's feeling really lonely, having lost a spouse, people want to say, well, you just need to get out more, get involved in something. And yes, that can help you not be mired in a state of being too alone all the time. But it's not that state of feeling lonely when you have lost a spouse can continue as long as you don't have your spouse. So
that's saying that you can be lonely in a crowd. That's
yes.
What I'm talking about. You might be with,
right,
but you'll still feel lonely. And
that's right.
Particularly for people who have, who lose their spouse. When they lose their spouse young, like you did, there'll be a different loneliness compared with people who might have been married for 50 years.
That's right.
Because 50 years together, they kind of, they nearly are one person.
That's right. That's right.
Feel like half of you's been chopped away. Yeah.
That's right. So that's one of those things where if somebody understands your loneliness, it doesn't take away the loneliness, but it helps you not feel alone with your loneliness. And that piece is what makes the loneliness not cause health problems. It's when people feel alone and misunderstood in their loneliness, like no one cares, that they start to have all the health problems that they're finding with loneliness. So it's an important distinction, I think.
Yeah, brilliant. That's absolutely fantastic. And I'm sure that it'll help a lot of our viewers out there.
Yeah.
Candice, another question I wanted to ask you. I'm an avid reader, and I wondered if there were any particular articles, books, websites, any resources that you would particularly recommend, that if you are grieving, they would be helpful for you.
Yes. Well, first of all, I'm working on a book. It's going to take me forever to get this thing written. It's not out yet, but that's going to be the best book on grief. but I have a grief ebook. That's a very short ebook about dispelling myths, common myths about grief. And I also do a blog that has a lot of articles about working with grief. So deeperdimensions.com is my blog, and there is on my website also you can see where you can download the grief ebook. But if you want to read, there are some really bad grief books out there, but there are a handful that are actually pretty good. If you've lost a spouse, Companion Through the Darkness by Stephanie Erickson was the best book I read. It's old now. It came out in the early 90s, but it's a really good book for the loss of a spouse. It's not sugarcoating anything. And then Getting Grief Right by Patrick O'Malley is a really nice way of giving people some tools about how to tell their grief story, which can be very soothing in working through a grief process. And Your Grief Your Way is a new one coming out by Shelby Forsythia. It's a grief day book. It's got a passage for every day of the year that just sort of helps you feel like you're not alone and like what you're going through makes sense. And then another one that might not be for everybody, but it's if you're experiencing a lot of anger and you've had an untimely loss, It's Okay That You're Not Okay by Megan Devine. It's pretty good. It's pretty angry, and she's pretty angry. So it's not for everybody. When I read it, I try to read all the grief stuff that comes out. I was no longer that angry when I read that book, and it was a little too angry for me. But if you're in that state of being angry, it's a good one. So
she also has, for the viewers, if you're on Instagram and Facebook, Refuge in Grief is her.
Yes.
Yes. So there are people who really do understand grief.
Yes.
To know whether you are being swayed in the wrong way or the right way, because there's so much information out there that is no longer valid.
That's right.
You know, like, for example, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who did the most amazing work with people who were dying. And
that's right.
5 stages of grieving. They're very accurate for people who were dying.
That's right.
But we are the ones, we the grievers, we left behind. So as
that's right.
Work was, those 5 stages, it's not only there's a lot more to
that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
I really don't like the stage model because it did get so misused, and I see more harm done to grievers with the stage model than anything, because people feel like they use it as a measure, you know, of where they are in their grief or if they're moving through it correctly or whatever. And
you know, there is no, as we know, there's no right and wrong.
That's right.
What kind of model do you like, if you can put it briefly, what kind of model do you work with, Candice?
I think, how do I say it? I call it the grief tending process. It's actually helping people learn to recognize what their emotions are, what the emotions are, what they're like, and what they need. Because that works no matter how big your emotions are or how long they last. It's learning to identify what your emotion is, what it's like, and what it needs. And the second piece is learning that there's a rhythm. I help people learn that there's a rhythm in grief. It's like you will discover your natural oscillations. It's actually a nervous system thing where you you'll start to notice there are phases where you need to pull in and heal, and that's more like the sad, pulled in, tender feelings. And then there's a having to go back out into the world without your lost loved one that takes energy and movement, and you go out into the world facing that world without your lost loved one, and then you're out there in the world that will feel good at first, then you feel the pain of the loss again because now you're out in the world without your loved one. So that causes you to pull in and do some more grieving, and then you get restored and you're ready to go out. It's not that obvious for a lot of people, but when you start to realize that is a rhythm, it's something you can trust. Let yourself have time to rest and not go out and not do stuff when you're in that pulled in phase. Know that that's going to restore you to take a risk and go back out in the world and spend some energy at another time, so those two things, grief tending, meaning tending to what your emotions are and what they need, and starting to understand your rhythms.
Yeah, Megan Devine also talks about tending to your grief.
Yes.
I think is a beautiful way of putting it, instead of making yourself better from, or
That's right.
Yeah, getting over. I mean, getting over
That's right.
all that terminology that our society imposes on grieving people is.
That's right.
Puts a lot of pressure.
Yes.
So,
and another thing I like to remind people of is that you can't feel that much all the time. It's not possible to stay with that intense of an emotional state all the time. So it is okay to distract yourself from your emotions sometimes. When you realize it's too much and you're needing a break, watch TV. Let yourself watch television. Let yourself do a mindless crossword puzzle, whatever. It's like, especially if you do that intentionally, like, I need a break from this, I'm going to watch a movie. That actually is giving your body and emotional state room to kind of heal and recharge a little bit. So
I was seeing a psychotherapist many years ago, and she explained, she said, sometimes your mind needs to go on holiday.
Yes.
That's exactly what it is. Movies,
Yes.
mindless, something frivolous, but it's restorative to you. It's rest.
Yeah, that's right.
Candice, if somebody had very recently suffered a loss, what advice would you give to them? So, I mean, I'm talking, it's a big loss and it's just happened.
It's just happened.
Yeah. Is there anything?
A big loss that's just happened, I would say more than anything, it sounds so trite, but it really is, be kind to yourself. Be kind, because you are going to be feeling things that you never thought you'd feel. You might be feeling, and you might feel nothing. You might feel numb. You might feel overwhelming sadness. It might move all around. You won't be able to think. Early grief makes it hard to think. You can't keep track of things. You're going to be you're just going to be having a really hard time. And so the main thing is that the emotions will run their natural course if allowed. And so if you can let yourself know, this is hard, it's going to look crazy for a while, be soft with yourself and allow yourself to have what you need, whether it's distraction or not going out. sleeping extra long, making plans all day because you can't sit still in the middle of it, whatever it looks like. So
yeah, I like to compare our soul to if your body's just gone into hospital to have a big operation and you've been in ICU.
yes,
Come home, you're going to have to take it easy for a little while before you can get back into your life.
that's right.
That your soul is in ICU.
I like that. Yes,
be really gentle. Don't do any pushing.
that's right.
Especially because it can be very exhausting, the whole process of grieving. So,
right. Yes.
So coming towards the end of our interview, Candice, what is the most important thing that you think you have learned after the loss of Marty, and then all the studies and all your clients? What are some of the most important things that you've learned in the process?
I think I've learned that humans are social creatures wired to love.
Yeah.
We are wired to attach. We are wired to love. We are wired to need each other. And because of that, we are wired to grieve, because we will lose each other, because we die. And what I find is that grief is actually a necessary and adaptive response to that kind of loss. And when you are helped to go all the way through a grieving process, I think it softens you. It brings gratitude for what you do have. It brings compassion for others suffering. I know that when you go down into the well of the deepest pain there is, you find that that's where we all join as fellow humans. So I think grief, one of the adaptive things that comes out of grief is that softening and a strengthening, where you also, as some people call it, post-traumatic growth, where you can come to a place where you know you can survive painful things, where you're grateful for what you do have, and where you have compassion for the suffering of others. And I personally think that a lot of the hardness in our world, where we are unkind to each other, is partially a result of the fact that we shut down our grief. We need to be polished and smoothed by going through grief when we have loss. So
absolutely. I mean, that's so eloquently and beautifully put. Thank you.
yes.
Is there anything else as a final word, Candice, that you would like to add?
I think just to punctuate that, anytime somebody is struggling with grief and it's not flowing, it usually is an opportunity to heal something old. That's just something that we don't look at. And I just wanted to reiterate that.
I must say that really jumped out at me when you were saying that. It just suddenly made such sense. And yeah, I do think we're kindred spirits, you and I. We think very alike in a lot of the ways of how our society is coping with grief and what we should be doing.
Yes.
So I thank you hugely for taking the time out of your very busy schedule. We're so honored to have you in this interview and to share with us that that grieving is normal, that the suffering that goes with it is completely normal. It is a process that we don't have to do alone, that we can have people walking alongside us. And so Candice, if people want to get in touch with you, at the end of this video, we'll put all your details up, but which is the best way for them to get in touch with you?
My website, which is deepcenterforgrowth.com, or my blog, deeperdimensions.com.
Brilliant. Wonderful.
And there's a contact form on my website if people want to reach me directly. And I do have, if you download my grief ebook or you subscribe to my Deeper Dimensions blog, I have a weekly email that I send out that sometimes has a link to a new blog post, but also just talks about emotions in the context of what's going on with grief, or what I'm thinking about grief, or what's going on with, like right now with the pandemic or whatever. So people find a lot of connection in those emails. So.
Okay, brilliant. So we'll put all of those details in captions underneath where we're speaking now, but also at the end of the video. Contact Candice, contact myself. The last question is, when do you think your book is going to come out?
I don't know. The problem is that it takes so much time I have to pay myself to take time away from my practice to write. And so my goal is to try to get that thing written in the next year. I've been working on it for some time, so.
Okay, well, we wish you the best of luck with that, and we look forward to it coming out. And once again, Candice, thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation.